You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and today we are talking about doubling the Canon, or DtC, as I'm sure we'll mostly refer to it as this episode moves on. This list is, in my opinion, one of the greatest online projects ever designed to expand the focus of cinema from the established Canon. It was originally set up as the flip side to They Shoot Pictures Dante's Top 1000. It was a simple time. 1,000 films in the TSPDT list, 1,000 films in the DtC list. And films included in the former were of course ineligible in the latter. However, doubling the Canon took a very different approach to They Shoot Pictures. The former is pretty much the greatest ever aggregator of top lists from respectable critics, academics, newspapers and magazines, creating something as close to the arguable absolute canon as possible. While doubling the Canon instead asked cinephiles like you and me to nominate 10, now 12 films, for them to then be rated by all participants. Well, this did make it harder for, shall we say, divisive films to do well. This voting system still made for more iconoclastic results. The biggest films were already gone, and now films seen by a fairly small percentage of the voters could truly shine. Even looking at the current top 20 today, we see everything from hugely respected films like Kobayashi's Human Conditions trilogy, Sembene's Kampti Tairoya, and Epstein's Cor Fidel, to films with less than 100 votes on IMDb, such as Ogawa's Narita, The Peasants of the Second Fortress, Shanahi's The Kayal Saga, and Rousseau's The Antiques de Rome. Today, films actually get revoted after a set period of time, which feels wonderfully interactive, especially now that it is co-hosted by icmforum.com, with a popular monthly challenge for the nominees and another one for the complete new list every year, where so many of us actively work on the films in question. Always eclectic, always with big surprises, and giving room for everything from the experimental to the forgotten classics. Doubling the Canon has become an institution for more than 15 years. And it is therefore so exciting to be able to sit down for a conversation with the founder himself, Lee Price, who currently serves as the Director of Development at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts in Philadelphia, PA. We'll hear about the origins of the project, the original aim and goal, how Lee feels about how the project has developed, and yes, we'll also get into nomination strategies, when and where you can vote, and share our sweetest victories and bitterest defeats. We'll also get into the harder questions, such as whether or not doubling the Canon should now expand to 2,000 films, seeing that the They Shoot Pictures Dante list now also shows the positions of 1001 to 2000. And even discuss the slightly more poisonous question of where doubling the Canon run now, with some critics even saying it's perhaps run its course, which I'm sure all of us at least will disagree with. And the slightly more friendly but still contentious debate of whether or not doubling the Canon should perhaps change its name. My wonderful co-hosts Saul and Tom are here as always, but I think we all really want to hear from you firstly. So please just tell us a little bit about yourself and how doubling the Canon got started, and then my co-hosts can introduce themselves and possibly ask some follow-up questions, as I'm sure it's just so much we want to know about the early days of doubling the Canon.
Thanks, Chris. I like origin stories, so this is kind of a treat for me to, I've never been at the center of an origin story before. And it turned out to be a fairly interesting one. I haven't given much thought to this lately in the past probably 12 years or so. But going back through my records here, it turns out that I have a fairly substantial library of records that I was recording quite a bit of what I was doing at the time that Doubling the Canon was coming together back in 2005. And so I'm just sort of awash in paper and documents that I have up on the screen right now, Excel files, all from quite a long time ago. I'm glad they're still digitally preserved here. So I've been trying to recreate the past here because I forgot a good deal of what I did at the time when I was putting this together, and just haven't paid much attention to it since. Went on to work on a number of other projects, and this has just been sort of in the back burner, documents saved on the computer. So I'm sitting here in New Jersey. I've got I came dressed for the occasion today. I'm wearing my Gertie the Dinosaur T-shirt. And I've got my coffee here in a Hedgehog in the Fog coffee mug I can sip from. And I just wanted to mention that because those are two films that have been in a number of previous iterations of Doubling, and both very close to my heart. I'm Lee Price, and from around 1999 to I'd say around 2012 or so, that's sort of a rough figure. I was known as Lee 109 on the IMDb Classic Film board. I was one of the first arrivals on Classic Film, and I really took it as my home. I was never the poster who had seen the most films, not even close to that. I was about average in the amount of classic films that I've seen in my life, of the very knowledgeable posters on that board. But since I was just there from the beginning, I sort of assumed an ambassador type role. I'm not sure if Saul remembers this, but he was probably the most active of the hosts today. And I think he probably remembers that a bit. My job was kind of a job I assumed for myself on the board. A lot of the boards were rather contentious and could be fairly unfriendly. The Classic Film board from the start was very snobby, and there's nothing we could do about that. That's our nature, and I fit in naturally with that, so that was fine. But we did want a cordial atmosphere. We did want it to be a very welcoming place, and so I do consider myself kind of. I was out there a lot. I was posting a lot, and I always wanted to make everybody feel very welcome there. My real interest at that time, and they continue to be very strong interests in film, were silent films, animated films, and the cinema of the fantastic. That would be horror, science fiction, and fantasy. And it's with an emphasis on films pre-1960. I like old movies. It's where I gravitate.
Probably why you were on the Classic Film board.
Yeah, during those first 2 years, from 1999 to 2001, I'm not sure if it was exactly Classic Film. There were a lot fewer message boards back then, and 2001 was when they introduced a whole range of different boards, and that's really where the Classic Film board comes into real existence. So with the Classic Film board as my adopted virtual home, I developed several games and projects just for the fun of it. And some of them were pretty ambitious. And maybe the most ambitious of them all was Doubling the Canon, which we launched in 2005. And then I ran it for 4 years before handing it off to Angel Gonzalez. And that was around 2009. I handed it off to him, and he just ran with it and did such a better job than I ever could. He really put his stamp on it and made it the success it really is now. So I'm sorry he can't be here today with us. Back in 2005, the idea behind Doubling the Canon was to take the 1,000 greatest pictures list at They Shoot Pictures, Don't They? And double it. At the time, for some reason, I always thought that I was taking a website that had been in existence for a long, long time, that this was a very established canon. I liked it more than the Sight and Sound canon, and it's the one I really adopted. I really never cared for the IMDb 250 at all. So it was my canon of choice. But it only came into existence, it turns out, in 2002. So it was pretty recent at that time. So it had been around for about 3 years. And so my proposal was to double it, to come up with 1,000 more films that that would be the regulars of the Classic Film Board, considered canon worthy. And so it took off. That's the very beginning of it, Chris.
Ainsley, and if anything, though, you knew how to spot something that would become quite big, because obviously today, they Shoot Pictures Don't They is undoubtedly one of the 2 or 3 most respected canons out there, along with Sight and Sound, of course, and probably 1001 Films to See Before You Die. So very good choice of a list to double, and I would probably agree with you that it is the superior one of the 3, simply because of the insane aggregator that's just been getting better and better and better. But of course, doubling the canon has its own, shall we say, unique traits and unique strengths that it brings to the table. So this will probably be a really good time to bring my co-hosts on board as well. Let them introduce themselves, say perhaps a little bit of when they first started hearing about doubling the canon, first started voting on doubling the canon, and what it is that to them that makes doubling the canon from the voting process to the final results so exciting.
Hi, it's Sol from Australia. Yes, Lee, I do remember you back in the day, and it was quite interesting on the Classic Film Board. There were a lot of games there. I remember, what was it called? Keeper, Sleeper, Sink No Deeper was quite a big exercise also. But yeah, doubling in the canon was definitely the once a year thing that got really interesting. I was part of the doubling of the canon from its very inception. So back in 2005, we started voting on, how we started on first? I think we might have started on the 1 years, and then the 2 years, and then all the way up to the 9, and then the 0 years. But what Lee got us to do is we were able to, from memory, nominate some films from different years, but it would be from the last digit of the year. So we would vote in 10 different processes, which why it took a couple of years for the list to be made. It was really one of the first ways that I got to really expand my cinematic horizons and watch films that I wouldn't be watching otherwise. I even remember, back in 2005, going to my university library because I was studying at uni then and getting out on a VHS, VHS back in the day, some of the old classics or whatever. I remember that's how I first saw Body Heat, which is one of my favorite films, the Lawrence Kasdan film that was nominated for the 1 years. And that was a fantastic film. So it was a great way of discovering films. And of course, it's evolved so much since then. And I guess, I've stuck with it all these years. I've always submitted my ratings. And I guess it's become a bit more competitive in years since, especially since joining iCheck Movies, because we have it as an official list there. So it's all about trying to get the most checks on the list. I'm probably going to hand over to Tom now because I've completely forgotten where Chris started off this question as. And I will add more in if needed.
No, you covered it. I mean, I asked what made doubling the canon, the whole process from the voting to the results so exciting. I think you covered it. You just love watching everything from it, even if you don't necessarily like it. So that's a great degree of respect shown towards the list. What about you, Tom? Do you remember when you first started participating in doubling the canon?
Hi, Chris. Yes, and I feel like a relative newcomer compared to everyone else here today. I first found out about doubling the canon through the iCheck Movies website, and I was watching a lot of films on the most favourite list and the 500 less than 400 list, and they seem to have a big crossover with the doubling the canon list. So once I'd worked my way through those quite a bit, and I wanted to branch out to even more lesser-known films, doubling the canon seemed to fit that bill. I first submitted some nominations in 2017, but I have to confess I was a little bit intimidated by the whole voting process, so I didn't bother following through with votes on that one. And then the next year came around in 2018, and I nominated again, and I joined in with the voting as well. And I've been doing it ever since, and I think the reason why I love it so much is just the opportunity to uncover some great films that may have fallen by the wayside, and also share my appreciation of those films that I find with others who may not have heard of them. And one of the great things is its unpredictability. It always seems to be the films that you think don't stand a chance that end up making the cut, and those that you're certain will make it fall just short. And another great aspect of it is the huge buy-in currently from the ICM forum. We run the DTC challenge in the build-up to the voting phase, and it has great participation levels. Everyone's eager to watch other people's nominations throughout the challenge, and I'd say that nothing is more satisfying than other users seeking out your picks and also sharing your enthusiasm for them. So thanks very much, Lee, for bringing this into practice, and I'm glad that it has continued for so long, and I hope it continues to do so well, because I have a great time with this every year.
I thought I might just jump in with what Tom said about the challenge, because we do tend to traditionally have a challenge on the iCheck Movies forum to see how many films you can see of the Doubling the Canon nominees, and I managed to see 133 films this year that were nominated for the Doubling Canon exercise. Most of them first-time viewings. I'd say at least 120 of them were first-time viewings that I managed to see from the nominations opening till them closing.
Yeah, while Tom was talking, I was looking up the stats from that challenge, and I can't believe he didn't mention that you also won the challenge. So you saw the most nominated films of anyone what was it again? April, I believe? Yes, last April. So very well done indeed. And it shows just how passionate you can be about this project. On my hand, I came 5th with 47 views. So that's a bit of a gap. Lots of other people just behind me there. So I think I just managed to nip ahead. But the challenge has made Doubling the Canon even more fun because it's more interactive. Thinking back, Doubling the Canon was always quite exciting. I don't honestly remember the first time I voted. It was on IMDb. I think it was when... I don't recall how I first heard about it because I wasn't as active on the classic board. I was mainly on the Film General board at the time. So I don't remember if there were cross-pollination where you could also vote on Film General, or if it were just threads sending you over to the classic board. But either way, I found my way there and I started participating probably sometime well after Saul, but probably say late zeros. So I've been participating for well over a decade now, and I'm very, very happy that it started to, even before the IMDb boards closed down, take hold on other film forums around the web as well. Today, I think it's only co-hosted by our forum and Super Champion Film Zone, which is a little bit smaller, but very good forum. And I'm also excited about how much it's grown. For me, what first pulled me in and what makes it so exciting is just what Tom mentioned there about the unpredictability and just the fact that such little known films can make their way to the top. Now, I haven't seen many of the least watched and least known films on the list. I have to be honest about that part. But it's just so exciting that you get these films with less than 100 votes on IMDb, less than 200 votes, less than 1,000 votes on IMDb. There's so many films that you will never have heard of if there weren't for someone sourcing them out and nominating them. And I feel that now that we also have these challenges, films that had no shot whatsoever in the past because they had to, appeal to 7, 8, 9 voters, they would have usually had to seen it before. And now that we have the challenges, you can do some really heavy promoting and start to get people to see these films that most people haven't heard of. And it makes it possible to nominate films that I wouldn't have before. So it's a project all around in terms of film exploration, sharing exciting films, and just finding new discoveries that aren't part of the established canon and which you often won't hear about elsewhere. That's the part that really, really excites me. And I think I've actually partially answered my next question with that, which is what it is Doubling the Canon provides that They Shoot Pictures don't, they can't, or isn't. And while TSPDT include many films that aren't necessarily that known, courtesy of, for instance, specific film curators, etc., who provided their lists, or their lists have been sourced by the aggregator. Doubling the Canon really shines a light at those unknown gems more, and it's just so exciting to see what films can appeal to that group of people and get that boost. And then you might find new favorites. I can just say right now that the nomination challenge is usually my best challenge of the year in terms of just finding new favorites. It's always the most exciting, just because these are films people truly, truly, truly love. By the fact that, that you can only nominate 10 or now 12 films each edition. So it comes with a strong sense of personal love, which is then amplified by the votes of others. So this, at least to me, is what makes Doubling the Canon so special. That beautiful, wonderful. Oh, is it 15?
No, it's not 15. It was 15 a few years ago.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and then it was decided there were too many nominations, so they decided, okay, we're going to make it 12. But then this year we had less than 1,000 nominations, so hopefully we'll go back to 15 next year. But I'm a more the merrier type of person. I'd be happy to have everybody have 20 nominations, but it's not up to me.
Well, that's a debate that you have at Sight and Sound as well, I suppose. So always a good debate to throw around. But I would love to hear from you guys as well. Like, what do you think it is that makes Doubling the Canon stand out from They Shoot Pictures, don't they?
Probably the biggest difference, I'd say, between They Shoot Pictures and Doubling the Canon is that the design of Doubling the Canon allows films to rise to the top or to be successful that haven't been seen by the majority of participants. Now, this is a really interesting quirk of the system, because if you think about most polls, the larger number of ballots a film is in, the more chance it has of being successful. In Doubling the Canon, it's actually the reverse of it, which we might get onto later on, but the more widely seen a film is, the less chance it has of making it, because all the films are rated in a positive or negative sort of way. So because there's a 0 to 6 score to rate the films on, a lot of popular films just tend to end up getting a lot of 0 and 1 votes, which brings down its average, and therefore a film with only 8 or 9 votes can actually rise towards the top, even though it hasn't been seen by a lot of people. So that creates a very interesting list, but this is probably a time for Lee to chime in after me if he wants to, before Tom goes. But it's something I've tried to argue a little bit on the forum about it, because it's something that, it makes an interesting, quirky list, but I don't know if it was like Lee's original intention. Because what we get a list where you have the majority of participants not having seen half the films or more. So things I've argued for in the past is maybe having like a 20% quota. So, if we have 80 voters, films should have at least 16 votes to be able to make it in up to the list. But I've suggested these things in the past, and they've been shouted down and at least been voted down. People like the idea of being able to get all these rarities into the canon. And look, I've got some of my own rarities into the doubled canon, so I guess I shouldn't be complaining. But I'm not sure if it was exactly, Lee's intention in the first place, that just by having, I guess, we're on the forum what we call a mafia or whatever, if we have a mafia of people really strongly supporting one film, you get one film in that, 70 other people are participating in the exercise hasn't seen. So it's a bit of a quirky list, and I guess it makes it different, and it makes it interesting, and it makes it unusual compared to all the other lists out there. But again, I'm just not quite sure if it was exactly Lee's intention that the doubled canon ends up being a list where the majority of participants haven't seen the vast majority of films.
I can respond to that immediately. It was a surprise to me right from the very first voting that this was occurring, because it did happen in the very first round of voting. It was very apparent that the popular films that many people had seen were not getting in, because there were a number of votes on the 0 to 2 level on the 6-point scale. And that was a small amount of people could really deflate the rating of a film that was getting a lot of sixes, more sixes, which is the highest rating than any of the other, a film that only had six votes for it might have 4 6 ratings and 2 4s, and that would give it a very high rating, while a movie that had 30 people voting for it could have 15 6s and some 5s, some 4s, some 3s, some 2s, some 1s, and it would just level that rating down to a point where it's not making the cut, although many people have seen it and loved it. And so it's been a problem from the start. I attempted to do a weighting system that was extremely primitive, and Angel has really improved that with a weighting average system, but I don't think he's really entirely solved the problem. I do consider it an ongoing problem that's a part of the process, and it's just trying to figure out ways to tweak the process to make a list that's the most attractive list possible.
So I think it's interesting that you say that this is a issue, because I'm not sure if all of the co-hosts, or certainly not all of the participants, would necessarily agree with that. So I have my next question is actually, I can reveal that before Tom starts speaking, what you see as the main purpose of doubling the canon. So for you, Tom, I guess you can actually combine these two. What is it that separates doubling the canon from They Shoot Pictures, Don't They? And what do you see as the main purpose of doubling the canon?
So my interpretation of it is that it's a chance for forgotten or overlooked gems to be rediscovered and reappraised. I mean, sure, there are lots of critically acclaimed classics in the Dublin the Canon, as well as all the ones that populate They Shoot Pictures, Don't They list. But it's a far more fascinating and varied list. And I think the reasons for this are because of their voting system that Saul and Lee have mentioned. And I know that it does come with its problems, but I also think that the voting system is one of its strengths. If you look at films that have been seen by the majority of voters that still make the list, then you know that the quality of that film is going to be something special if a popular film has made it in, despite a few detractors. And on the flip side, if a handful of people support a lesser known film, then it's going to be something that is enticing for cinephiles to seek out if their fellow cinephiles value the film's importance and think it's worthy of a place in doubling the canon. So I think that it's a great chance for overlooked films to shine, and also just to do what it says on the tin, basically double the canon, expanding the films that are available for cinephiles, people who want to broaden their horizons and seek out new and exciting cinema. So I think I may have answered both of your questions there, Chris, or I may have waffled, but either way, that's my response.
No, that was a very good job of answering both more or less at the same time, Tom. So well done. And I think Saul already kind of revealed his view as well. He's more interested in it from the perspective of actually doubling and expanding the canon. So he seems to want a more canonical turn to doubling the canon. Would that be right, Saul?
I'm not sure if that's necessarily what I want at the moment. I mean, at the moment, I'm mainly looking at it in terms of turning unofficial films official on iCheck Movies, so it's a bit of a different objective, trying to, well, not so much to gain the extra checks, but to gain the extra exposure for these films that otherwise aren't going to get views unless they're actually official checks. So I'm approaching it differently these days, but definitely in the early days, I was, very concerned about it. I actually remember back in, I guess we're going back maybe 10 years ago. This was definitely when Zeded Wads was out. I remember somebody from iCheck Movies was actually on the IMDb forum arguing about us because we were on the classic film board, talking about the fact that these films only 10 votes on IMDb have made it into the canon, and should this actually be allowed? These films that clearly haven't been seen by a lot of people. And some person, I can't remember who it was, somebody from iCheck Movies was there and was saying, well, IMDb is not the only website out there. And it actually isn't these days, because these days Letterboxd is much more popular. But, it's like, you can't just say 10 people have only seen it because it just says 10 votes on IMDb. More people actually have seen it. They're just not using the IMDb website. And one of the arguments that was brought forth at the time was, if 3 people have seen a film and they think it's the best film ever made, it deserves to be on the list, even if nobody else has seen it, which is a really interesting philosophy. And there's this Greek film, Aeneas, I don't know how to pronounce it, but that made it into the 1001 to 2000 part of the They Shoot Pictures list for a couple of years, just because it happened to be on 3 sight and sound ballots. And it's a film that it's not commercially available. You can only see it in Greece at certain times of the year. It's in 22 segments or whatever, so I don't think anybody's properly seen it either. But it was on 3 sight and sound ballots, which was enough to get it into, I think it was about 1,700 or whatever on the They Shoot Pictures list. So it's an interesting quandary in terms of, are those films actually valid? Is it valid to say, that 3 people think it's the best film ever so they can get in there? But yeah, look, my position on the list has changed a lot since I first started participating. But definitely when I first started participating in my pre-iCheck Movies days, I was definitely of the view that I wanted these to be, films that a decent amount of people had seen, and therefore we could actually make a good judgment call about whether or not they were actually great or not. Whereas, my view was if, only, because there never used to be 8, it used to be much lower. I think it used to be sort of like 4 or 5. If only 4 or 5 people had seen it, was enough to actually get into the canon, is, that are valid enough to have it in there. And I remember there was a user, BK, on the classic film board, who was suggesting that any film that makes it in should be immediately revoted the next year afterwards to give people a chance to see it, because a lot of people hadn't seen it, which got all really complicated. I don't think we ever went down that pathway, but definitely I remember there was a lot of, angst, I guess, or a lot of concern back at the time about it not actually being a genuine canon doubling exercise. And the reason why I put the question to Lee before is because that's something that's been argued probably the most. Without him being there, it's been argued the most in like the time from it migrating from being in his hands to in, I don't even pronounce his name, Angles. Moving from his hands into other people's hands. That was probably the thing that's been argued the most. What was Lee's actual intention? Did he want to have like another canon of obscurities, or did he actually want to have like well-known, well-seen films that happen to be liked by a significant chunk of people voting for them?
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that would be really interesting to hear from Lee as well. Because even though the list has changed a lot over the years, especially now that They Shoot Pictures Dante have revealed essentially their full top 2,000, and the 21st century list from They Shoot Pictures Dante ineligible as well. So there are well over 3,000 or around 3,000 ineligible films now, I believe.
I think the total list is around 2,700 right now. If you for the They Shoot Pictures, it has 1,000, the top 1,000, which everybody can easily access, and then there's the 1,000 to 2,000 list that's a little bit more difficult to access, and then there's the 21st century list. And the problem with the 21st century list is that there's overlap with the other 2 lists, and I think it would just be another straight 1,000, so it would be an easy 3,000 if it wasn't for that overlap. But there are films that are on the 21st century list and are on the 1,000 to 2,000 list. And because of that, it comes out to around, I added up somewhere, but like I said, I'm a washing paper here. I think it came to around 2,713 films right now that are on the TSP list, the They Shoot Pictures list. And so that's adding an additional 1,000 from doubling for around 3,700 films right now.
That's quite a large amount of very respected films that cannot be voted for in doubling the canon. And for my part, at least, I almost think this makes doubling the canon more interesting, because you're taking away very respectable big choices and you do make the list more eclectic. So I am a little bit torn. I know what Saul means when he says, we should increase the threshold for minimum number of votes allowed, because that at least gives it a stronger degree of support behind each film. And in my mind, the purpose of doubling the canon is canon expansion rather than straight up highlighting canonical films. Because if it was just highlighting canonical films beyond 1000, or now beyond 2700 or so, it wouldn't be as exciting. Obviously, that would be interesting and exciting as well. But I like this idea that the doubling the canon exercise is a doubling, at least still in name, of what should be in the canon. And that's how I always approached the topic. And when you see these films that have so little support behind them, or rather so few views behind them, that gets in there and then get that heightened exposure with many, many people deciding to seek them out because of the list, and that they become more and more canonized because of that. That's really exciting to me, and one of the things that really appeal to me with the process. But I think this is the perfect time to go back to Leland, because at least for the very first few years, he has the he essentially has the right to say what the original intention was. So was your intention to create a list of an extended list of canonical films that people should seek out, or was it to highlight more obscure films, or was it a bit of a mix?
My intention was to create a game. I was interested in the process and setting up a process that everybody could enjoy for the selection of the films. And to that degree, I think it's been an incredible success, because the various tweaks that have gone into the system with Angel's work on it, it continues to engage interest in the process of the voting. Actually, I find that a lot more interesting than the end result. I find the voting, the nomination procedure to be where all the fun is in the process. It's funny that the criticisms that Saul was bringing up are the exact problems that I was struggling with back in 2005, because they were obvious right from the beginning. And if people get riled up nowadays with proposals to change the system, I was making changes in the system back then and letting those changes, I publicized them on IMDb at the time and let them know how I was changing it. And there was an uproar at the time. People thought that it was kind of outrageous that I even considered this to be a problem. But basically, all the problems the problem that Saul is bringing up was built into the system from the very start. And I've never been entirely happy that it exists. What I really did want to come out from with the whole program was that combined list. I never thought that doubling the canon should exist independently from They Shoot Pictures. I always wanted them to create a holistic list of 2,000 wonderful films that people should take a look at. Is this time, Chris, for me to back up a little bit into the origin of this story, because I think the origin of doubling the canon.
It makes perfect sense.
So this was a follow-up to another project. I was involved in a huge project back, I think it started in 2002, might have been 2001. It was the first big game that I ran on IMDb Classic Film, and that was fixing the Oscars. And we had a ton of fun with that. And one of the ways I set it up was started with the year 1927, because it was the first year of actual Academy Awards. And I wanted this to be fun for me. I always want these games to be fun for me as well as everybody else. And when I was setting it up, I looked at what this was going to be like 50 months down the road, when I hit a period of time that I wouldn't really be enjoying that much. And for me, that is, I know this is going to surprise most cinephiles, because this is like a beloved time in film history for so many people, but I have very little interest in the films of the 70s. And maybe even more so in the films of the 80s. That little block there of 70s, 80s, I was looking at, do I want to be running a system that is going to have me doing 20 years that I'm not so interested in a row? And there were people on the board, too, on the IMDb Classic Film Board, who have specialized interests in, well, they're mainly interested in movies of the 30s. They might be interested mainly in movies of the 50s. We had specialized areas that we particularly loved. And so I decided that the best thing to do was to jump around and do this system that I later moved into doubling the canon. Saul was mentioning that earlier, the strain system where first we'll do the years that end in 0, then we'll do the years that end in 1, then we'll do the years that end in 2. That all started with fixing the Oscars because I didn't want to do 71, 72, 73, 74, all in a row like that. So instead we did 1927, 1937, 1947, and all up to 1977. And then we went back and did 1928 and worked on it through that. So that was fixing the Oscars. When that whole process ended, I'm like, well, I think I'd like to start a new game. And that was where doubling comes in, where I started to get into conversations. I was in conversations with Bill Georgaris. I'm not sure exactly his pronunciation of his name. Bill Georgaris is the founder and the guy who runs They Shoot Pictures, that wonderful website. We were trading back from the very beginning about starting this and his support for it, which was just delightful that he was sort of involved from the very beginning. And I set it up with that same system for the 10 years. In the first vote that we did with, I think it was the 8th, it became obvious that the popular films weren't doing well. And, I realized that's going to create bad blood in the whole system. So my solution to that was incredibly primitive. And it was primitive because I just don't have the Excel abilities to come up with a solution that's, an effective algorithm. So what I did was I did it on paper. I just dropped the lowest vote for every 10 votes a movie received. So when a movie hit that 10 vote plateau, I could drop a 0 rating from it. If it hits the 20 level plateau, I would drop 2 ones from it. Like I said, this is very primitive in that the movie with 19 votes, I'm dropping 1 0. The movie with 20 votes, all of a sudden I drop 2 zeros. So the movie that gets 20 votes arbitrarily has an advantage over the one that has 19. So a lot of built-in problems with the system that Angel cleared up when he moved in to taking over the system. But that's how I did it. And, if it was 30 votes, I would drop the 3 lowest votes. And it was just trying to compensate for this, what I always considered a very large problem of the weighting of the poll towards the most obscure movies, the most esoteric. It was a problem that I foresaw from the beginning, and it's always been the biggest controversy about that. And of course, nobody was ever happy with my completely arbitrary decision to just drop votes at a certain level. But it was the easiest way that I could deal with it when I've got a ton of votes that I have to count. The whole system began, you see, I was a little confused going into this because I hadn't gone back and looked at the records, and I had it from Angel's notes that doubling the canon began in 2007, which all sounded right to me, and I always went with that. But then when I went actually back into the system, it turned out that it was actually launched on the board in 2005. And because we did those 10 rounds, we were slowly building up to a list of 1,000 films. It wasn't just tweaking the list like it's done now. We had to actually build that list. So that was a long-term process where we had to go through 10 rounds. And that took a while. Each round took approximately 2 months. We had to have nominations, and then we had the votes on them. And so it took a long time to pull the list together, and the list was not published until 2007. And I think I did 2 updates after that. And the updates were, I think the first update, we switched to a chronological way of doing it. So it was sort of, we divide the list up into quarters, basically. And we were first voting on, say, movies from the very beginning till around 1930, then 1930 to 1950, 1950 to 1980, and then 1980 to present. It wasn't exactly those categories, but it was like that. But I think we did it in 4 different rounds for the 2008 round. And then in 2009, I might have simplified it all together to just one simple round for tweaking the list to basically an update of the list. And I think ever since then, it's stayed as an update. But at that time, 2009 was a rough year for me. That was the year my mother died, and for various reasons, that led to a major blogging project that I did based on some family letters that I discovered, and it was the first blogging project that I ever did. And so as I was taking up blogging, that's when I abandoned doubling the Canon, and Angel immediately moved in and said he'd take over. And I said, great. I think that's the origin story.
It's really interesting to hear how it all started. I can't even imagine the toil of just go through so many editions of just voting in film after film without even having a complete list, and then doing it all over again afterwards. I just figured that, at least when you first established the project, you would start updating the list. So that's just an incredible effort and really interesting to hear. Were the lists similar? I guess that would be my first real question, actually. Do you recall if the 2007 list and the 2008 list were fairly close in comparison?
I'm looking forward to this. This is where I wanted to take a look at the original list that we were coming up with and then see how they compare nowadays. And statistically, I'm not coming up with any real trends that I can discern, but lots of areas for future investigation, exploration. Okay, I want to take what I'm looking at here is our very first 2007 published list, and the number 1 film on that is The Man Who Planted Trees. That's a Canadian animated film, around 30 minutes long. Frederick Bach is the director of it. One of my favorite movies. Not my favorite movie by Frederick Bach. My favorite movie by him is Crack, which was on the list previously. Unfortunately, is now altogether gone from the whole 3,700 film list. But Man Who Planted Trees was our number 1 and is currently number 176 on the doubling list. So it still exists on the list. It's dropped considerably. And it went from, this would have been a number 1 on our doubling list would mean that on the total canon, and I very much thought of this in terms of total canon, it was placing at 1001 on the total canon. So Man Who Planted Trees was considered one of the canonical films out of 2000 at the moment, and placed at 1001. Now it's really dropped considerably because I would consider doubling films to be after the whole 2,700 films of the TSP list. Then you hit the doubling list. So it's down in the lower levels. Instead of being high on doubling, it's on the lower levels of the entire combined list when you combine them all together. So that's just my way of looking at it. So it has dropped actually a fair amount from 1 in the original list when it's just 1 out of 2,000 to number 176 on a list of 3,700 movies. Number 2 in that first list was the Dardenne brothers, their movie The Sun. And that is now 607 on the They Shoot Pictures list, and it's number 72 on the 21st Century list. So it's done extremely well. It's moved way up into it's one of those movies that was fairly when we did the voting on this, it would have only been 3 or 4 years old. Came out in 2002. Yeah, we were saying at the time, well, this should be in the canon, and They Shoot Pictures, it went into the canon. It is firmly in the canon now. Number 3 and number 4 are fascinating because they remain so static on this list the whole time, which is a surprise to me, and that's the Human Condition movies, 1 and 2, Kobayashi's movies of the early 1960s that he did. And they were in positions 3 and 4 on our doubling list at that time, and now they're in the first 2 positions on the doubling list. So they've remained extremely high on the doubling list. And the thing that I don't understand is why they're not in that They Shoot Pictures, at least in the 1000 to 2000, because they're wonderful.
Yeah, that's so true.
I don't understand why they still are on the doubling list. I would think that they should be have moved up considerably higher. I'd put them in the top 1000 easy.
Yeah, it's true. I was also going to say that Human Conditions 1 is 4th on the current list. So the top one is 3, second one is 2, and then Red Angel squeezes in between them on the current list. And then there's the first film. But it's really interesting that these have been static from the beginning. And obviously they've at least been revoted once. So The Man Who Planted Trees, great film. I think the fact that it was number 1 on the list for so many years clearly led a lot of people to seek out that film. But the same is obviously true for the Human Conditions trilogy. And still to this day, even with all of the people who have seen them, they are on top. So that's just truly impressive and shows that they really should be part of the canon. I'm not sure why they're not. It's probably partially because they're fairly recently rediscovered. I think they got like the Criterion release sometime this last decade or so, which put them really into the limelight. But I would have assumed and expected Daisy Pictures don't dare to pick up on that in some way. Maybe Sight and Sound will change that now with a new poll. Maybe they will do really well, and that will affect Daisy Pictures as well. But we'll have to wait and see.
For our number 5 here, this is a mystery to me, so I'm hoping somebody will help me out with this one. Careful, He Might Hear You is an Australian movie from the 1980s. I have seen it. And it was our number 5 film in our first voting. And I was just on a poll on Facebook with a film friend of mine. And he was doing the greatest Australian and New Zealand movies. And Careful, He Might Hear You plays very high on his list there, and it has disappeared from the canon altogether. It is not on doubling, and it's not on the They Shoot Pictures list. That's a mystery. It's a film that, well, not really a mystery. Obviously, it was voted off the island at some point, but I'm very surprised. And the thing that I would look into there is how well is Australia and New Zealand represented on these lists? That's because I'm so surprised that this important Australian film has dropped off the list. The number 6 one that I have here is Black Rain, which is that's like the Human Condition in my mind. It's dropped to number this is the Black Rain from 1989, which is very confusing because there are 2 Black Rains from 1989. There's the Michael Douglas one, which is of not much interest, frankly, and there's the Shohei Imamura Japanese movie Black Rain, and it is a stunning movie. And it's 144 on doubling, so it has dropped from our 6th position to 144 on doubling, but at least it's still in there. It belongs in there. And it's another one where I would question, well, why isn't higher on the They Shoot Pictures list as well? Just a little surprised that it hasn't significantly raised as well. Number 7 is Onibaba, the Japanese movie from the mid-1960s. It's number 1. It's on the 1000 to 2000 list of They Shoot Pictures, don't they? Another one of my favorite movies. I would like to see it in the top 1000, but I'm happy that that it has the honor of being in that 1000 to 2000 area at least. I think it really belongs there. Number 8 is another mystery, A Streetcar Named Desire. I never understood. It's Elia Kazan movie from 1951, the big Brando breakthrough movie, and I don't understand why it wasn't on the They Shoot Pictures list from the start. That is a complete mystery for me. And it's now number 650 on the They Shoot Pictures list, which is, I think, exactly right. I think the positioning here is very appropriate for it. I wouldn't put it much higher than that, but I think it belongs on that 1000 list, if only for influence. But it's a wonderful movie, too, especially just for Vivian Lee's performance. So that was our number 8. Number 9 was another new movie. It was Werkmeister Harmonies, the Bela Tarr movie. That was new at the time. That was 2000 movie, and we were voting in 2000 2005, 2006 on it. And so, new movies take time to get into the They Shoot Pictures canon. And it didn't take that much time for it to hit the canon eventually. It's currently number 370 on the They Shoot Pictures list. I don't know. I like Bellatar movies a lot, so I'm always happy to see a Bellatar movie in there. I just wish he'd come out of retirement and make some more movies. And number 10 on the list, and that's as far as I'm going. I just wanted to go through the top 10, our original top 10, as opposed to, well, where are they now? Number 10 is the other movie, along with Careful He Might Hear You, that has been annihilated from the list. It's disappeared completely. And that is One Froggy Evening, the Chuck Jones animated short from 1955. Very popular animated short, one of Chuck Jones' most famous movies. It is now on none of the lists. So it's not in the 3,700 when originally it was 1,010 on our original list. So yeah, I just wanted to look at it from that perspective because where are they now? I would welcome the chance to go through all these. So much fun looking at what's become of them and what kind of trends are here. Like I said, I'm looking at the trend of the Careful He Might Hear You disappearing. What could that possibly mean? And I'm also looking at the trend of nearly complete absence of Chuck Jones as compared to what we were originally looking at. Animated shorts are not doing well in this total canon, and animated shorts are sort of an obsession of mine. So I'm very, very sad about this, that they're not doing well. In our original, at that time, there was one Chuck Jones film there were no Chuck Jones films in They Shoot Pictures at that time. And we voted, I think, 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, 10. We voted 10 Chuck Jones films into our first doubling, which I think a lot of people thought was way too many. I was comfortable with it, but a lot of people thought it was way too many. And since then, now we're down to Duck Amuck being in the They Shoot Pictures 1,000 to 2,000 area. It's at 1,211. And I don't think there is any other representation of Chuck Jones in the entire list. So we've gone from 10 Chuck Jones out of 2,000 to 1 Chuck Jones out of 3,700. So that is how the great have fallen in that case, and that holds true for a lot of the great film and a lot of the great animators of film shorts. They don't fare too well on these particular lists.
I am actually surprised that he's not doing better in the expanded They Shoot Pictures Dante list at the very least, because they are on a lot of animated lists. So it's very odd that an aggregator would not actually show any others than Duck Amuck. I think I have the reason why they are doing more poorly on doubling the canon, and that's quite simply because what Saul mentioned earlier, that iCheck Movies plays in there. A lot of people on iCheck Movies participate in these polls, and when you have an incentive to watch as many films as possible, it's much easier to watch short films, which means that, as Saul can testify to, you watch a lot of films you don't necessarily like or you don't necessarily love. And with that, you can get a film that was maybe loved by 20 people and liked by another 20 people, and then suddenly you get another, say, 40 people in there that either just thought it was okay, hated it, whichever, and just pull down that average. So that would be my quick guess as to what happened there. But I really like how you've been following this list over the years. So I would love to know, do you still vote?
I guess I have to admit, I voted around 3 or 4 times since giving it up, and I might have nominated movies once or so, but I really haven't done much. I haven't been that involved. I never became active on iCheck Movies. And so I never really became involved in the process there. Angel would occasionally invite me over for voting and remind me about it. And like I said, a few times I did, and I always felt I should. But because I've always been very supportive of Angel on the whole project, This is also just part of my personality too. I love to do major projects and I totally immerse myself in them. I'm a bit more of a leader than a follower. I start things, I build these projects, and I don't participate in that many other people's. So in the end, I haven't been the conscientious continuing voter that I know I should have been, and I'm not proud of it. I wish I'd been voting all along. And when I start complaining about, well, why isn't this movie on the list? Why isn't this movie on the list? I have no right to complain. I should be voting in that case.
Your vote could have single-handedly saved all of the Chuck Jones films.
Yes. I think I should be in there doing that. I also think it's interesting that I do think the list, I'm not too familiar with the ICM forum, but I'm very familiar with the IMDb forum as it existed back in the old days. And I know that my obsession with animated shorts, and it was a bit of a personal obsession because a lot of my life just revolves around what happens in my personal life. And my kids were born in 92 and 95. So when they were born, I was thinking, well, that's going to really cut into my viewing time. What am I going to watch? And I said, well, I will watch the greatest animated shorts and I'll share them with them. So my interest in animated shorts really begins largely just because my kids were of the right age at that time. Well, where was I going, Chris? Can you help me out here? I got a little bit off track with my digression.
Well, it's hard to say it was such a digression, Lee, but you were talking about how you should have kept voting and why your fascination with animated shorts started. So perhaps it was leading into other people not necessarily being as fascinated by animated shorts?
So on the Classic Film Board, there was a lot of discussion of animated shorts at that time, just because I was very active and I was sharing my intense interest with them. And I don't want to go into this, but I know some of Angel's interests, and I know a lot of his favorite films are not getting on the canon. But I noticed some of his favorite films are getting on the canon, and they were being voted down formally on the IMDb days. And I think there are these little film forums really representative of much than the film forums themselves, or than the message boards themselves? I think our games like this are very tilted in the direction of the stronger leaders, the ones who post regularly and are sharing opinions most often. I do think that that you can see that reflected in the list. And I think that a lot of my personal interests and prejudices are reflected in the early Doubling the Canon list. And I have a feeling that the interests of some of the strong leaders on the ICM boards are being reflected in the current list. I'll just raise a question. Looking at the gaps on the entire canon list, I immediately go to some of my favorite films and wonder what happened to them. And, I thought they were good, but they dropped off the list. And I'm interested in some of the observations, some of the losses that others have felt, seeing some of their favorites not make the list, or they were on the list and have fallen off the list. I'll just bring up a few complete mysteries to me on the current state of the canon. One is the situation with the film director Jack Arnold, probably best known for Creature from the Black Lagoon, and also known for all his work on Gilligan's Island. Later on, he had an interesting career. Jack Arnold is represented by one film on Doubling, which is one of his westerns, which I hear is very good from a friend of mine who's interested in classic westerns. But the big thing that Jack Arnold did was The Incredible Shrinking Man. And if I'm right, it's not on any of the lists right now. It's dropped out of the 3,700 great movies list. I think that's been a sort of strange casualty of the system. I grew up on the old horror movies, and I loved the very early Universal golden period of movies. And through They Shoot Pictures, we have Frankenstein, Dracula, The Old Dark House, The Mummy and The Bride of Frankenstein all represented. And I love that they're represented. I would want to retain all of them in that 3,700 total films that we're looking at as canonical. The one that's missing, and the one that's just been recently voted down by the Doubling Group, is The Invisible Man. And nobody's going to tell me that The Invisible Man is in any way inferior to the other ones that are up there. And Chris's
I actually think
Incredible
so.
Shrinking
Sorry.
Man is number 960. So it looks like that's on the actual TSP. Okay, so it is on the They Shoot Pictures list. Okay, so I can breathe a sigh of relief that The Incredible Shrinking Man is still out there.
Yeah, it just got promoted.
I'll toss in one more director who's not currently on the list, but boy, he's one of my obsessions just because I'm into the cinema, the fantastic. I was so happy that Criterion finally put out box set of Carol Zeman movies recently. He's one of my favorites, but there are no Carol Zeman movies on the entire list. It's sort of an area where you have certain genre interests, and I don't know how well genre's doing on the doubling list. I'll bring up another one, too, that has disappeared. We had in our top 50 of doubling when we first voted. I mentioned in the beginning I was wearing a Gertie the Dinosaur t-shirt. Gertie the Dinosaur is one of my favorite movies. So I was there at the Museum of Modern Art for celebrating its 100th anniversary back in 2014. Just a milestone in film animation, Winsor McCay. Winsor McCay is not represented on any of the lists. And neither is the great Russian animator Vladislav Starowitz, who did The Cameraman's Revenge, another milestone in film animation, and once again, not represented on any of the lists. These are my low comments. So I was wondering from the hosts what their key movies are that they really wish were doing better in this whole system.
I'm pretty sure Cameraman's Revenge actually used to be on the list, and it was one of those films that was put up for revote this year. And I finally sat down and watched it, and I downvoted it. I didn't actually downvote it as such. I mean, we'll get into it later on. I think I would have given it a 3 out of 6, which is actually, good enough to make the second half of the list. However, a 3 out of 6 is actually a downvote, but we'll get into that later on. It's one of those quirks with the number system not quite matching up to how it was originally intended. In terms of films that I'm disappointed at making the list, I'm not really sure. I guess I've known for quite a while that my taste in film doesn't really coincide with the average film goer out there, so I guess there's not much that I'm disappointed in. I guess there are probably maybe more comedies than anything else, because I know comedy is a very divisive genre. Tried to nominate Dr. Plonk, which is this awesome silent film, but it's from 2007. So it's a modern contemporary silent film made to look like it came from the 1920s, and it does actually generally look like a 1920s film. But it's a comedy, and people are watching and going, they didn't make me laugh, I'm going to give it a 0 out of 6. And you can't really do much with a mentality like that. So I don't think comedies do particularly well, which is a little bit sad. I wish they did a bit better. I'm a big genre fan, so I guess I would like that horror films would do better. Not so much classic horror films. I'm really bigger on more modern horror films, or I guess 70s, 80s onwards. So I guess I would like those to do better. And I guess there's just other stuff also. Like this is like some really like creative martial arts films, which have got no chance of possibly making it because the people voting for it is a bit of a niche sort of genre to get into. And I guess it's probably the trickiest thing. If you want your film to do well, it needs to actually have at least 7 other people vote for it. And the 7 other people voting for it might not be people who are actually voting for it because they watched it expecting to like it. It could be people like me who decided I want to see 133 films in 1 month to be able to watch the most done in the Canon nominees this month. And therefore, they're just watching anything regardless of whether they would like it or not, which was me in April this year. I'm watching a bunch of these films, including ones I'm expecting not to like, and in most cases not liking. So,
And it's all.
Yeah, look, I guess there's not too much that I'm too disappointed in. I was disappointed that, I don't know, something happened with the rigging of the system. So it used to be 1,200 films. Angel actually expanded it from 1,000 to 1,200 because we realized that 3.93 wasn't a very good cutoff point, and films that are getting, that score actually should make it into the canon. So he expanded to 1,200, and then he unexpanded it, and it's gone back to 1,000. And when it went back to 1,000, Ladybug, which is an amazing film by Frank Perry, that was recommended to me on the Classic Film Board. I know when we were first voting for it got like a whole bunch of 6 votes. I think it just missed the cutoff by just like one more person needed to see it, but like so many 5 and 6 votes. And anyway, that one got shafted when the whole process got changed. But then Angel rejigged the formula again, and it suddenly reappeared back in the list. So I'm really pleased about that because that's one of the very few films in my all-time top 100, which otherwise are on no other official lists on iCheck Movies.
So I just want to mention how much I love Ladybug. That film just blew me away. I was speechless when that movie ended. So I'm joining you in saying, oh, it's so nice that is on the list.
Okay, well, that's awesome. We need you to vote next time and just submit one vote for Ladybug with a 6 to make sure it stays on the canon in the next revote. That's an excellent film, and it's a film which I only discovered through the Classic Film Board because I actually was quite big in the director Frank Perry because I'd seen a few of his other films, and then BK, one of the other regulars on the Classic Film Board, actually mentioned, well, I actually think this is actually Frank Perry's best film. And when I saw it, I was already a big fan of him, and I was totally blown away. After The Swimmer, it's probably my favorite Frank Perry film, but he's done at least 5 or 6 really great ones for my money. So, I'm really pleased that one's back on the list.
I think I share in your disappointment, Sol, the fact that genre cinema is quite underrepresented on the the Canon list. Like you, Lee, and you, Sol, I'm a big fan of the fantastical and horror and sci-fi in particular. So I've recently made it my thing to try and push as many genre films as I can onto the list. I just had a quick look, and currently on Dublin the Canon, there's 16 films that are classified as horror films on there, going off the tags on the iCheck Movies, which I feel like is a massive underrepresentation. But I'm quite happy to see that 3 of them are films that I promoted for the challenge and have been successful. And it seems tricky to get horror and sci-fi onto the list, and I've found that films that combine genre with like art house sensibilities tend to do much more better than straightforward genre films. The ones that I've pushed onto the list were Angustia, which I know is one of Chris's favourite films. We talked about that a lot during the Spanish horror podcast we did a couple of years back. And then there's also The Necklace, which is really visceral horror film, very macabre and well worth a look. And then there's also The Man Who Thought Life, which it's more of a sci-fi than a horror, but there are elements of horror and paranoia in there. And I was really pleased that made the list this year because it's an incredibly well-made film, really intelligent and thought-provoking. And it's nice to see these smaller genre works getting some attention through the list. I just wish that there was opportunities for more well-known horror to pop up on the list, but maybe if I keep pushing we'll get some, who knows. But I can't think of any particular films that I've been disappointed that haven't made the list or have dropped off. I mean, I'm disappointed every time one of my nominations doesn't make it. There's a bit of disappointment there, but that's the nature of the list. But there's nothing in particular that stands out to me in terms of that.
I guess I will mention one more of my disappointments, because I actually do. I've been trying to form my own top 100, my top 250. I don't know. I'm trying to regroup my list because I really haven't done a top 100 list of my favorite films in over 10 years. And so I've been slowly working on that, but I wasn't on any of these boards for tracking all the movies that I'd seen. So it's been a very slow process for me. But from the beginning of the list that I did over 10 years ago till now, I do have one film on the list that is not in the 3,700 film list, and it's in my top 10. So I'll mention that one too. It's sort of the brother to The Man Who Planted Trees. It's Frederick Bach's other movie, Crack. Crack is in CRAC with an exclamation point after it, for the sound of a tree falling. And Crack is, I prefer it to The Man Who Planted Trees. It's one of my all-time favorite films, partly because I'm in the museum business and it speaks to me as a museum film. But it was on our doubling list. It was, I think, around 150 or so on our original doubling list, and it's fallen off. And man, I love that film. So everybody get back and vote for that one too. And like I say, yeah, as Sol encourages me with Ladybug. Yeah, I have to get back there next year and vote for Ladybug, and to vote for Crack.
Really happy to hear that. And one thing that's also come out of this episode is that I now feel I really need to see Crack, because I actually haven't. So I'll throw that up quite high on my watch list. I see it's only around 15 minutes, so that should be fairly easy viewing to get around to. And I thought Man Planted Trees was absolutely great, so I have fairly high expectations there. I also think I have a bit of an explanation on why the list has changed so much over there and why there are less genre films. So you mentioned strong leaders earlier, and I don't really think ICM Forum have strong leaders in the sense that they have massive trendsetters. I think a lot of different people have the possibility to start trends, but it's rarely the same person. But I think the biggest switch is that it used to be run through the Classic Forum, and then it was open to more and more people. And I don't think that ICM Forum is that focused on classic films. There's some of the same posters, so you have those people, but you don't have that concentration of them because you get lots of other groups in there. And that's one of those things with ICM Forum that's a little bit different perhaps from many other forums, that there is no majority. For instance, I'm not sure if you know about the Film General spin-off FG2 and FG3, but those were more art house focused, and art house is a decent minority on ICM Forum, but not the biggest group. Similarly, you have a decent group of horror fans, you have classic fans, you have lots of fans of modern films. You just have many different groups, and then you need to find the overlaps between those films. And I think the fact that you don't have the concentration of people who love classic films will probably damage the power of, say, classic short by Chuck Jones, or a lot of classic genre films as well. We would probably have done a lot better back then.
On the classic shorts, I was going back through my records, and I found a conversation that I had with Bill at They Shoot Pictures. And yeah, he was looking at the same situation with They Shoot Pictures and the sort of prejudice of the list. I don't mean prejudice in a bad way. I just mean a sort of natural prejudice that seems to be built into the system against short films. So he proposed in 2008 and actually put together a separate list that was going to go on the site called Brief Encounters of 250 short films. Oh, it looks like it does exist. Okay, I didn't even know it existed. So he did separate them off, and that always raises the question of, well, do we do that or not? What do we consider to be a film? Do we consider the a TV miniseries to be something that we can vote on? Made-for-TV movie, a short film? Is there a length quality? Is there a maximum length before it becomes not really appropriate for this type of thing? So it's just one of the things that the list makers like Bill and me, when we're creating these processes, we're also looking at these questions for what's missing and how can we better represent what's missing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think especially with shorts, even though they're included in the main list, it makes sense to have a separate list, simply because a lot of the lists probably will exclude short, or at least not give them due focus. And it's worth noting that Bill also created a list of the 1000 best noir films, as well as an underrepresented perhaps genre, or a genre he just perhaps loved. So maybe we'll see this for other genres in the future. And of course, there are also similar projects not run by Bill, like the They Shoot Zombies, don't they, list of the 1000 greatest horror films. So even if they're not on his site, it's also inspired others to go down his route. To answer your question, Bill, I have quite a few disappointments. There's one that I have been trying to get on the list for probably ever since I first started voting. At one point, it was my favorite film of all time. Not quite so anymore, but still a film I really love, and that's The Panic in Needle Park. It's the film that gave Al Pacino his role in The Godfather, because Coppola saw that. On the basis of that, he argued with producers for ages to let this amazing actor into his film. And he's absolutely spectacular in it as a junkie just scrambling for his next fix. And his co-star, who pretty much is disappeared off the planet, Kitty Wynn, delivers a perhaps even better performance. It's a masterclass in just broken love, essentially. So it just bothers me that every single time, I don't even nominate it anymore. Sometimes other people nominate it, but I probably nominated it the first 10 or so times I had nominations. And the frustration was it would always be, say, 10 points below the threshold. It would never get those extra views. Or if I got new people to watch it, they would balance each other out. So that's probably my bitterest disappointment. A shock of mine is actually how poorly one of my all-time favorite directors is represented there. And he's a fairly famous and well-respected director as well. Guy Maddin, I mean, he doesn't have a single film on Doubling the Canon. He doesn't have a single film in the standard Days with Pictures Don't They list. And he only has one single film on the extended 1001 to 2000 list, which is My Winnipeg. And that's just, it boggles the mind.
Chris, I'm fairly sure that Heart of the World is in there somewhere, because I was looking over Guy Maddin's movies too, because we share a love of Guy Maddin. And as long as Heart of the World is in there, I'm happy. That movie is just simply amazing.
Sorry, Heart of the World is actually not in there anymore. I think it might have been downvoted. I seem to recall it being there as well, but when I search now, it's not.
Well, that's tragic.
Yeah, that is really tragic. Yeah, I was assuming these films would be there, and The Heart of the World is one of my all-time favorite short films as well, and one of my all-time favorite films. So it's stunning. Brand Upon the Brain is not there. That's in my top 10 of all time. And he has so many films that's well received. There are in critic lists. It's just bizarre that then only one of them on the expanded Days with Pictures Don't They list.
And I'll throw in a little plug for Dracula Pages from a Virgin's Diary. I love that movie. It is maybe my favorite Dracula movie out there. Nobody ever votes for that. I wouldn't expect it to end up on a 37 movie list, but just a Guy Maddin love of mine.
Oh, and Soldis found that Heart of the World is actually on the 21st century list at the very least. And so is the saddest music in the world. So he actually has some representation there on the other list. And I really don't look at the 21st century list that often, if I'm honest with you. So thank you so much for pointing that out. So some love for Guy Maddin overall. Maybe that will spread out to the mother lists over time. So we talked a little bit about our bitterest disappointments, but what about our successes? Like, what are the films you're most happy that you managed to get onto Doubling the Canon?
I think I touched upon this briefly when I was going through the disappointment stage, as I mentioned the horror films that I was really happy to see on the list. I think one of my other greatest victories was for a film that entered the list this year, which is a brilliant Tunisian crime drama called Beauty and the Dogs. I know that Sol really enjoyed it. Enjoy may be the wrong word. It stressed him out. But I mean, I always appreciate films that can stress out the viewer and put you in a position of anxiety. And it's basically about a young girl who was raped by several police officers, and she tries to file a complaint against them. And it falls upon deaf ears, and it's a brilliant film, very hard-hitting, but well worth watching and very deserving of a place on the list. So I'm glad that made it in.
In terms of victories, I guess I've had a few successes over the last couple of years, which is good because most of the time I'd be averaging 0 films a year. I mean, it was getting to the stage where Angels Being Nice was letting us nominate 15 films, and out of 15 films not make the cut. But the last couple of years have actually been a bit more successful. I managed to get one film in this year, which is The DMZ, which is a great Korean film from the 1950s. It's not available in a very good print, but it's just an excellent film about 2 kids coping with, being stuck in the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. Otherwise, I've recently got Be My Wife in there, which is a Max Linder comedy. The guy did 7 Years Bad Luck. So this is another excellent film by him, and I was surprised I managed to get enough support for that, especially because it's a silent comedy, and comedies are just so damn divisive that you can never count on them to do well. And I guess another victory would be Brother's Nest, which is an Australian film that I introduced to the forum. And I guess it's got enough of a thriller edge in there that it's universal enough that people actually liked it enough to vote for it and get it in there. So, yeah, all very pleased about that.
I think my biggest success was actually this year when I finally got another comedy, another film I've been trying to get in since the beginning of my voting record on the poll. I mean, every single year for the beginning, I was voting for The Panic Needle Park, and I was voting for a Japanese comedy from the 60s called Bakudan or O-Bomb. And every year it failed until this year. It's towards the very bottom of the Doubling the Canon list, but it managed to get over the threshold. I'm so happy. It's one of the craziest films of all time. It combines the Yakuza gangster with like surreal touches, bizarre comedy, even sing-along musical moments. It's so tongue-in-cheek, lots of explosions everywhere, and it's just utterly bizarre. And I think it's mostly my nominations that have managed to get Okamoto, the director, quite heavily onto the list as well. So looking at the current Daisy Pictures on the list, he doesn't have any films there, but he does actually have 5 films on Doubling the Canon, including The Elegant Life of Mr. Everyman, which is also one of my all-time favorite films. And it's so nice to know that, you can make a bit of a difference in terms of a director's status, I guess. Another director I've been pushing for years has been Yoshida. I got a few of his films in there as well. So I'm quite happy that I've been able to reach people with these films. And this year, I think I got 5 or 6 films I nominated into the list. That's also partially because I have been changing my voting strategy to play it safer. So in the past, I would pretty much just nominate a set of films I really loved. Then I started nominating new films every year to test it out. And this year, I tried to at least make sure it would have a minimum threshold. And that gets me thinking about our nomination strategy. And I know we haven't participated in a while, Lee, but for Saul and Tom, how do you decide which 12 films you nominate? Do you just go with whichever 12 films you love the most or feel most passionate about at that moment? Or do you actually put some thought and strategy into it?
This year, I decided to, I guess, not put strategy into it, but I decided to try something different, and it ended up being less successful this year than last year. So I don't know if I'll try it again, but this year, I purposely chose 12 films from 12 different countries. I just found that to be the easiest way to narrow it down because every year I'm watching over 1,000 films, most of them first-time viewings. So I'm seeing lots and lots of films that I'm liking every single year, and it's very hard to choose between them. In previous years, I've done stuff like I've nominated films that would fit in with the challenges that are being run in the same month as the doubling exercise. Never really took off. People just watched what they wanted to watch. So what I ended up doing is last year I just went with some of the more recent films that I'd seen or the films I'd seen more recently that other people liked, and I managed to get 3 in the list. And then this year decided, look, I'm just going to try and do 1 film per country. And look, I'm actually really pleased with what I came up with because I managed to get some very underrepresented countries in there. The film that I nominated from Moldova actually got a score of over 4, so it actually got a very high score, but it didn't have enough votes to get in because they didn't have at least 8 votes. And I managed to get the Korean one in that I talked about before. So I'm going to probably try that again next year, 1 per country. Not because it gave me a good success rate, but I guess I'm at this stage in the life where I realized I resigned myself to the fact that unlike Chris, I'm never going to be able to get 5 films in there in 1 year. But just in terms of narrowing down and working out what to choose, I just think it worked well this year. And because Chris did mention a little bit, I try and avoid re-nominating films that failed in the past. I know when there's a razor-thin margin, you always think, maybe somebody would like it a bit more, but generally that doesn't happen. So I generally try and avoid re-nominating films that have failed in the past.
For the first few years, I did exactly that, Sol. I just kept re-voting my favourite films, and I was like, why are these not on the list? They need to be on the list. But obviously, the same bunch of voters, not much is going to change, so I learned that lesson the hard way. But nowadays, I put a bit more thought into it. Not so much a voting strategy. I just consider the films that are more likely to resonate with the majority of forum users. I think I've got a reasonable idea on what would do well, having participated in all the polls and the challenges that we hold there. So I also try and push films. I think it was just this year that I went for it. Tried to push films that didn't appear on any lists at all, any official lists on the forum, and that proved quite successful. It was my most successful year this year. So I'm going to keep following that loose strategy and also trying to push horror and sci-fi films and just see if that proves to be as fruitful next year. Fingers crossed it will.
I completely forgot to mention a bit, like Tom, I try and also choose films that aren't on any official lists or aren't on any permanent official lists. So the 12 films that I chose from around the world this year were all films that were on one official list or less.
Unlike you and Tom, I am not really that focused on ICM, at least not anymore. And when I see films on one list or two lists, many of them are barely seen because they are on certain niche lists, for instance, from that country or from a genre, from a type of film or list that people aren't really actively working on. So I don't really take official check status into account. But as I mentioned, what I started to do is to actually be not necessarily sneaky, but to start looking up stats a bit. So I start looking up, okay, how many people have seen this film? I look at ICM stats because I know there's a large overlap. So for instance, if I see that 6 people I know from the forum have seen it there, then I can kind of perhaps, or more, then I can kind of guess that, okay, this should hopefully get more than 8 votes. I can put my hope that someone from the Super Champion Film Zone will have seen it as well, for instance, in desperate cases. So I tried to look at it like that. I also looked up some older stats this year from past votes, which is probably why I finally got 5 or 6 films. I didn't go back to check the exact number onto the list this year. So that was, I think, my best result ever, and the strategy worked. I will, however, be changing it around next year because of how well the game element of the challenge worked. So I think I'll at least be looking at 4 films that has essentially no chance to get onto the list and use those to promote during the game stage and get them to holdover status. I think that's what I'll try to do. So let's see if that works better for me and if I can get more people to watch some very underrated films. And talking about underrated films, that leads on to our essentially last questions, where we look at how the purpose of Doubling Canon may have changed a little bit over the years. And my first one is a little bit unrelated to this, but I guess it depends on this, how much should we actually include. So we talked about how They Should Pictures, don't they have extended their list to 2000, and with the 21st century list, we're talking about around 2,700 films. So do you think Doubling the Canon list should be expanded to 2,000 films or even more to live up to its name and to give exposure to even less seen films and other favorites? Or do you think we're good at 1,000 films?
Yes, and yes. It should definitely be expanded to be more. As I think I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I'm a more the merrier type of person. And I think if the official canon is 2,000 films long, the doubling the canon, because it is doubling the official canon, should be 2,000 films also. And I know the rating scale has changed a bit over time. There's no longer the guide that Lee originally put in place. But with the guide that Lee originally put in place, any films of getting 3 or above were actually films that were meant to be good enough to be in the doubled canon. So I think if we expanded it, you're not going to get films that are getting like a 1 or 2 average. You're going to get films that are getting, a 3.4 or 3.5 score actually might be able to get into the 2000 film doubled canon. I think it would just allow a great diversity of films in there. I've already said that horror is very underrepresented. I guess Australian 80s films like Careful, He Might Hear You might be underrepresented also. But look, the bigger or the more expansive the doubled list can be, the more variety, the more breadth it's going to have in there. I think that only possibly be a good thing. I mean, I know Angel's mentioned a few things in the past about possibly it being too overwhelming for people. There's a lot of films involved, but if from my point of view, I would be perfectly happy with the doubled canon list being 2,000 films. I'd say it would even be ideal.
Saul brought up about the original list, the 6-point list, having if you're voting it at 3, you actually think it does belong on the doubling list, and that's as Saul was mentioning, that's very true right from the very beginning. But one thing that does surprise me about the continuation of this project is that cutoff line that's I think consistently fallen between 3.5 and 3.7 for getting on the list has been consistent for more than 15 years now. That was the cutoff line that we were coming up with for 1,000 films way back when we started, and it hasn't varied that much in all the years since.
Yeah, very true. Looking at it now, the cutoff rate was 3.75 last time, I think.
Okay, so if anything, it's gone a little higher. I think it might have been around 3.6 or so for a little bit in the very, very early days. As far as this whole question goes, I don't have an opinion. I'm not a player, so I don't think I really deserve much of an opinion on this. But I just like that the game still exists. And as for all the details of should it be 1,000 films or 2,000 films, should you change the rating system, all that's process stuff that should not be held sacred in any way. Go ahead and change it and make it as good a game as possible.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and tell Angel that we have your blessing to make it into 2,000 films and see what he says.
Contrary to Sol, I think 2,000 films is pushing it slightly. There's a concern that the quality of some of the films towards the lower half of the 2,000 list may not match those on the higher echelons of the list. And also, not all of us are able to consume as many films as Sol. As jealous as I am, how many films he can watch in a month, I can never compete with that. And I just feel like if the list was extended by another 1,000 films, I'd never get round to anywhere near to completing it. But I mean, I suppose that's not a fault of the list itself, but that would be a concern of mine.
Yeah, I think that's an issue. I think another issue is that 2,000 list could possibly scare people off a little bit because it would just look so expansive. Though, of course, you can always just watch the same film from the top. I'm actually neutral on this. I can see advantages and disadvantages to expanding the list. As selfish people would probably like to see it expanded because so many of my favorite films that I nominate end up on 3.6, 3.7. So that would have been so good in terms of just actually being successful. But yeah, I can also see the negatives. But another question that ties in with this then is if we are not expanding the list, if we keep it at 1,000 and we're not really doubling the list anymore, Dacian Pictures don't have kinda doubled their own list themselves, or actually that's exactly what they've done. Does that mean that we should get the name changed? Does it mean that the Doubling the Canon project has run its course, or is it not an issue at all?
Well, I think you guys know where I'm coming from. In order to keep the name, I would suggest just make it a doubling list, make it 2,000 films. I mean, otherwise you're going to have to rename it 1.5 times in the list, which doesn't quite have the same ring to it.
I don't think the name should be changed. It's almost something of an institution now for some people. It's, well known, and I think adjusting the name could lose some of the association that people have with the list currently. If the number of films in the list was changed, I don't really think that's a problem because it has already changed. Maybe if it was doubled, the list renaming could be considered, but I'm happy with what it is at the moment. I think it should remain.
I'm neutral on naming, and I'm neutral on the expansion to 2000, but I think I should be neutral as I'm not too involved these days. But as a founder, I already mentioned that I don't think any of this should be sacred. I think it should be discussed, but I don't have any real opinion on changing it.
I kind of agree with most of what's been said already. I agree mostly with Tom on the fact that doubling the canon, the name, it's an institution, it's a brand name. I don't think that should be changed, even if we don't double the amount anymore. I've even had a vote on it, and the old name stayed put. I don't remember if it was an official vote or just to see what people's stances were, but clear favorite was keeping the doubling the canon. So we can see if Paul gets his wish and is eventually expanded to 2000. That would be interesting to see. But as it is, I'm perfectly happy with the length and with the name. And this actually gets me to our very final question of the evening, which is how excited are you about the next edition? And for you in particularly, will you be voting this time?
Okay. I will vote this time. Okay, I will vote this time.
Very good. So beyond having a wonderful conversation, we've also got one extra voter. So I'm delighted to hear that. Here, pressure works.
I'm always excited for the Dublin the Canon. It's one of my favourite annual events held on the ICM forum, and whether that's because I discover some new favourites among other people's nominations, or some people discover favourites from my nominations, then I'm happy with that. As long as, people are discovering new great films, then for me, that's the main part of the process that I enjoy.
In the twilight of the IMDb message board years, so guess 2014 to 2017, the doubling the canon exercise was really the one thing that I look forward to every year, because it was the one thing that would really keep me focused and actually give me a solid list of films to look through rather than trying to work out what I feel like watching. I actually have something to concentrate on and work towards. So yeah, I look forward to it again next year, especially because I'm becoming a bit lighter on the challenges we've got on the forum these days. So I'm looking for other things to pique my interests and trying to be one of the top 10 voters, which I managed to be this year. I was one of the 10 people who gave the largest number of votes for on the ballot. That was a real big, made me feel good. It doesn't really amount to much. But I'll be aiming for that again next year. And it's just really great, especially being able to see how my progress on the list changes, just because I have to have seen more of the nominated films, whether I like them or not. And I don't know if I'm ever going to complete the list. Probably not. I mean, I'm not even close to it at the moment. But I am slowly making progress from year to year. And it's always exciting to see what films people come up with to watch, especially when they're better known films that I've just never thought to watch. I mean, I like The Green Mile. The Green Mile and Life is Beautiful, for whatever reason, get nominated every single year, even though they're way too popular to ever be on the list. But there are some other films, just reasonably well-known films that just get nominated by somebody who doesn't really know, that doesn't stand much chance. Even though it doesn't stand much chance, it actually gives me that incentive to go out and watch it. So not just the obscurities, just some of the other films I missed along the way. It's just great having something which I can hone in on and really focus on. And like this year, maybe get through 133 nominated films.
Lofty goal, Saul, and I can just throw myself onto the excitement train, if you will, as well, because the Doubling the Canon month, or months even, are some of the best in my cinematic year, and I look forward to it every year. So really looking forward to it in 2023, 2024, and for hopefully all foreseeable future. And if any of our listeners have not yet participated, you can vote and nominate films at icmforum.com. If you haven't already, feel free to create an account. And beyond that, thank you so much for listening. and join us again soon. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.